questions at the end. Make sure to remind people that they look for the chat box if they're having trouble finding it via the 3 dots, please. Otherwise, I'm going to turn my camera off and hide here in the background. But it's such a pleasure, and Dan will follow up later.
Great, thank you, Karen.
All right.
All right, well, welcome everyone. Welcome to the 16th Annual Sustainable Business and Design Conference here hosted at the Fashion Institute of Technology. We are delighted to welcome you to this particular session here on day 2 of the conference, which is titled Finding Worth in Waste. And my name is Daniel Benkendorf. I'm an associate professor of psychology here at FIT. And I'm very excited to welcome my guest, who is Jessica Schreiber, who is the CEO and founder of FABSCRAP. Many of you have probably heard of that. So if not Jessica, you probably heard of her too. But if not, you've certainly heard of FABSCRAP. But I'll go ahead and I want to pass the baton to you, Jessica, so you can tell us who you are and maybe if you could share a little bit about your story and what FABSCRAP is.
Sure. Happy to be here. Thanks for that intro, Daniel. And excited to talk to you about your research and work as well. My name is Jessica Schreiber. I'm the founder and CEO of FABSCRAP. FABSCRAP is a nonprofit that works with the fashion industry, interior design industry, entertainment industry to collect and recycle or redistribute excess and unwanted materials from the design process. And so we are a recycling service for these companies. We're also a community of volunteers and makers and doing a lot of education. And then we have fabric thrift stores. So we're also aiming to be a resource for the next generation of makers and designers by providing easy access to sustainable materials that have been saved from landfill. We're working with about 650 brands now. We're collecting about 6,000 pounds a week, and we just passed 1 million pounds saved from landfill. So we're really trying to divert as much as possible, reuse as much as possible, and make sure that fabric stays out of landfill.
Excellent. So I'm curious, and I'm sure others are as well. How did you get into this? So were you just really concerned about clothing waste? Did you just sort of happen into waste, or has this been a lifelong interest? I'm curious to know how you got into
it. The long version. I was actually wanting to be a doctor, and that's what I went to undergrad for. I was going to study biology, but in taking those science classes, I found myself much more interested in sort of environmental sciences, ecology, geology, and then eventually sustainability and climate science. And I had a professor who said that the science is there, but scientists can be bad communicators. In that it's hard for them to sometimes share information in a way that is meaningful and digestible for people outside of like science journals, and removing jargon and making it accessible. And so I thought that was a solvable problem, and I added another degree in education. And so really a lot of my interest is climate science, but also like how do we make climate science something that people can understand and relate to and act on. So that's what I went to grad school for. Climate science at Columbia, and I had an adjunct professor who worked at the Department of Sanitation. They were starting their clothing recycling program, and I asked to intern. I've always been interested in waste and recycling. I think resource use and wanting to make the most of the natural resources that we have, make sure what we do use is used to the greatest extent possible, that we're able to recover what we're not using, etc. All of that has always been really important to me as part of biological systems and earth systems and our sort of interference with that. So yeah, always been sort of interested in waste, and this was sort of an entry point. So I interned at the Department of Sanitation as they were launching the Refashion NYC program, which collects unwanted clothing, shoes, home goods, etc. And ended up working at sanitation for 5 years, overseeing the city's clothing recycling program as it grew and also their e-waste program. So that was sort of how I came into textile waste in general. I got to know a lot of the city's nonprofit groups and kind of see how material moved through secondhand systems, which was really eye-opening. And because I was running that program for the city, as brands started to have questions about what they should be doing with their textile waste, those would end up in my inbox. And there were probably 20 to 30 brands that were all describing the same type of waste from their design office, but we didn't have a good place to send them. The existing nonprofits all deal in secondhand goods, not so much in raw materials. And so that was sort of the light bulb moment for me, was why can't there be a thrift infrastructure for the raw materials? There's tons of makers and creatives and artists and designers in the city who could use this material if it was made available to them. And so that's kind of how that all got put together.
It's really interesting. So you kind of literally got your hands dirty at the Department of Sanitation
Yeah.
and discovered that there was a gap that you could address.
Exactly.
That's great. Inspirational, I think, to all of us. So since you see this problem of textile waste on a day-to-day basis, and you see it up close and personal, can you just give us a kind of paint a picture of how bad it is? What is the scale of the problem?
Yeah. We'll start with post-consumer because I think that's what we're all most familiar with. Post-consumer meaning it has been bought and used and is now at the end of its life or unwanted. So the waste that we create in New York City, just New York City, is 200,000 tons of clothing, shoes, textile materials every year. So just our 5 boroughs every year, 200,000 tons, which is 14 times the physical weight of the Brooklyn Bridge. So massive amounts of material are being landfilled just by our city. I think nationwide, it's about 6 to 7% of the nation's total waste stream. So that doesn't sound like that much, but when you look at what's in municipal solid waste, a good percentage of it is traditional recyclables, metal, glass, plastic, paper. The next biggest percentage is compostable material or food waste. And then after that, the next biggest piece of that pie is textiles. It's also the fastest growing segment of the waste stream because of how disposable clothing is becoming. It's coming down in price, but also down in its sort of life and use.
Right.
And so we're seeing more disposable clothing enter the waste stream, and it's the fastest growing segment of waste. Where we're working in pre-consumer, what was really like sort of challenging and inspiring way to me is that we don't have good measures of that.
Mm-hmm.
Residential waste is very, very deeply studied by all of the cities that have to manage it. I helped do those studies when I was working at sanitation. But business waste is not studied in the same way, and it's definitely not regulated in the same way, measured in the same way. And so we don't have great ideas of how much businesses throw out. And that was one of the things that I wanted FABSCRAP to help illustrate and address. And so we measure everything. But the best estimate that we could find is that for every pound we throw away as a consumer, the business created 40 pounds of waste upstream, which means commercial waste is potentially 40 times greater than what we're creating as individuals. And it's not being measured or regulated or tracked. And that was what really was sort of like felt unfair in my mind and what I wanted to address. We have slightly like more specific numbers from a recent study that says in the design process, the supply chain of clothing, about 12% is wasted in design and production, which comes out to something like 6.3 million tons a year. That's globally. So 12% doesn't seem like that much, but when you really break it down by volume, 6.3 million tons is massive. And so there is a lot of waste in every part, I think, of the supply chain from start through all the way to finish when we're disposing of it as consumers.
Yeah. yeah, so given the scale of the problem, which seems enormous and almost, hard to even understand the scale of the problem and the amount of waste. I like the idea of the Brooklyn Bridge, although it's terrifying, the 14 times the weight of the Brooklyn Bridge every year, just New York City. But so given the scale of the waste, what do you see as the main challenges to bringing that number down? What do you see in terms of, is it the type of materials that are being used in production? Is it just because it's not being studied? What do you see as the main challenge?
I mean, there's a few things. I think it's not really tracked, and so that's part of it. Is like I was saying, we just don't really have great numbers to even know what needs to be changed and how and what the best solutions are. So I definitely think deeper and more realistic studies about textile waste along the whole supply chain would be really valuable in helping to change that. On the consumer side, I think there's a couple things. Clothing just isn't constructed to last as long, and so that's a major contributor. Is the turnover is just so much faster, so the waste is generated at a higher volume. So I think thinking about um, goods that are meant to last or buying secondhand from something that already exists is really valuable there. I don't think it's going to completely stop the flow of waste, but can help. Um, there's obviously, I think a lot of people are hoping that there's some tech innovations of like, well, couldn't we recycle all of this? And I think one of the big challenges there is a lot of the tech that's being developed, and it is being developed, is still really specific to fiber type. So we can recycle this item if it's 100% cotton, or we can recycle this item if it's 100% polyester, 100% nylon. But that's just not the way that clothing is constructed anymore. It doesn't really account for the infinity number of blends that is possible in the textile waste stream. And so those things are good first steps, particularly with cotton and poly being the vast majority of the fiber used to create clothing, to address those two first. But in blends and then the myriad of ways that like different things are constructed and the components of that garment needing to be deconstructed before recycling really complicates and slows down that process.
Yeah, yeah. So you've touched on a couple of things I find really interesting already, and one is you talk about the primary goal, and most of your activity at FABSCRAP is looking at business waste, right, and addressing business waste, commercial waste, and how important it is to address that. And then you also said something earlier that there's a lot of work, we understand consumer waste. That has been studied, and you did some studies at Department of Sanitation. And so I've thought a lot about that as our culture really is doing two things simultaneously. It's I don't think anyone would argue that we're immersed in a very consumerist culture here in the U.S. And a lot of the problems that we have. So in terms of what kinds of things are thrown away, I think a lot of the messaging is that it's really consumers' responsibility. So, and you can see that even when you buy something from a retailer, often it's here's what you should do with the product at the end, or here's what you can't do right with the product. Don't throw it away. We've all seen packaging that tells us we can't do this or that with a product. So there's a lot of messaging that's directed to consumers. I think consumers feel the weight of that responsibility and really feel like they need to make the right choices. They need to buy better. They need to recycle things. They need to reuse. And then we're also bombarded with advertising messages that are telling us to use more, right? So it's kind of a paradox, I don't know, this rabbit hole that we're in. And so I'm wondering if you think that businesses are starting to take on some of the responsibility for this and starting to see their role in, I guess the responsibility in the end use of the products they're selling, or their responsibility for design and production waste. Do you think that's happening?
Uh, that's an interesting question. So one of the reasons that I think FabScrap has grown really successful is that it is something that is in-house to address. And so if for a company to like make the change to recycle their design waste, it's something that they can do internally. It doesn't require a lot of consumer education or consumer changes. And so I think that's one reason why FABSCRAP has done well and grown so quickly, is because it's an immediate change that companies can make from within their own operations. I think what's interesting there, and just to like note as a side remark, is that it almost never happens C-suite down. The responsibility is definitely coming from like the design office or the fabric team, or sometimes even the facilities team, looking for something better to do, where there's almost like some guilt about the fabric that's been going to landfill. And so I don't necessarily think it's like companies having this shift. I really think it's employees at the companies who are having a shift and wanting to feel better about their workplace and the company that they work at, and trying to make the company and their industry do better. So I really see like individuals as a driver, even within big companies, of sort of that shift in awareness of the industry's impact. As far as companies taking more responsibility for their products and the end of life of their products, I don't think we have even scratched the surface of what's needed or possible there. And I don't think brands are going to be in any big rush to do that. I do think, though, that that is like one of the main ways that we could reduce clothing waste, is having brands have a greater responsibility, whether that's through policy, or through some kind of restrictions and regulations, that whatever happens end of life is so based on the design. Whether or not we can recycle it, that's a material choice. If we could deconstruct it, that's a design choice. If it's repairable, that's also how it's made. And so how long something lasts, all of those choices that we have as a consumer at end of life are actually so influenced and almost dependent on design decisions. And I don't think that's really taken into account. I think there needs to be much more responsibility there. And so there's a lot of education, I think, that has to happen. And I think one of the hard parts is that designers and anybody who sort of like works in fashion knows how much education has to happen to be able to design product, to also ask them to understand sustainability and end of life options and current recycling technology and deconstruction and reverse supply chain. That's a whole other full-time job. And so I understand why designers aren't able to kind of like take all of that on as a role. But I do think starting to have those conversations, and like at FABSCRAP, letting brands know that like we can't recycle spandex right now, does help influence their material choice. And so the more that we can tie end of life to design, I think it starts to reinforce the responsibility there, and people can start to make better decisions. But I don't think we're going to see brands rush to do that. The way that I've seen extended producer responsibility legislation play out is normally very costly to the product makers. So I don't think we're going to see brands rush to take on those additional costs or get involved in those programs unless they have to. But I will say that I've seen that policy be really effective. Extended producer responsibility was what happened in New York State that meant we couldn't put electronics at the curb anymore. It held producers of electronics responsible for recycling of their products. And when that policy passed while I was at sanitation, we saw our e-cycling program explode, like exponentially grow, with immediate compliance by individuals wanting to make sure that their TV was going where it was supposed to go. And so I could see the same thing happening for clothing if there was a EPR policy that required clothing take back or required brands to fund the recycling of clothing instead of having it go to landfill. I could see that almost overnight really changing the whole system, but would be costly and needs a lot of additional infrastructure and education, I think.
Yeah.
That was a really long answer to your question.
No, I think it needed a long answer. I think you gave us, here, our business here at FIT is the education and educating designers specifically. So I think you gave us a lengthy to-do list for ways to do it. But also, I think, in your response, you said that you've seen a lot of the change directed by individual employees or maybe groups of like-minded employees, right, who are coming in wanting to change things. And to the credit of their supervisors, they're being permitted to do that, but it's really the changes coming from those employees. And I think that gives, our students, maybe who are going in entry-level positions, some hope that they can wield that kind of influence when they get there.
Yeah, I have seen, I actually gave a presentation or like a lecture at a class at FIT, and someone in that class interned at a really well-known company, and just as an intern suggested FABSCRAP, and that company signed up for service. So I think even as an intern at these companies, they are, like I was saying, the designers in those teams are so inundated with their own cycle of work that to be able to present these new sustainable ideas to them and kind of educate them about what's possible, you actually have a lot of value to add in that case, because you're coming in having left a program where you can be more informed, do some research. And so it's a huge value add, I think, when you can bring those new initiatives into the company that you're working at or interning for.
Yeah, that's fantastic. It's a great example because, if it's not as if all of these companies are, resistant to change, it's that they're very busy and they may not have the knowledge or, the ideas. And so folks who
Exactly.
do enter the companies can bring that. And like you said, it's a huge added value.
For sure.
Yeah, I saw in the chat that yeah, a reminder. So anyone who's here that may have a question for Jessica or for me, you can post it either in the chat and we'll monitor that, or you can just say it. You can speak it too, and we'll be able to hear you. So just keep that in mind if you do have questions. So I thought another question that I had for you, Jessica, is there are a lot of things that can happen to textiles after at the end of their life, right? So they can go to landfill. We know that's not what we want, but there are these other options, right? So there's obviously reuse. I think most people understand that, but there's things like downcycling, upcycling, recycling. You mentioned spandex is not recyclable. You mentioned 100% polyester, 100% cotton blends. Could you help us understand a little bit of what the major, I guess, what are the dominant or most common things that you see in terms of diverting a textile from landfill? Where does it go? What are the things that happen to it?
Yeah. I'll start post-consumer with sort of like, where does your clothing go? I would say the main thing there is, if you can donate it, there's a lot of for-profit companies, but by working with a local nonprofit, they're able to possibly resell it, and that money helps fund their charitable mission. And so I think for sure donation is a needed part of that disposal chain. Then I think past that, most nonprofits and for-profit clothing collectors in the city use a second-hand market where they will sell what they can first, but then it goes to this second market where it's sorted by item type, not necessarily for resale value as like individual items, but just like women's dresses, men's jeans, kids' shoes, and that's baled and then shipped in bulk, sometimes to other parts of our country, sometimes overseas. They're pulling out stuff that is definitely in no condition to reuse, and that will probably get landfilled or recycled, which I'll explain more. They're also pulling out things that are particularly trendy. So one of these markets I know was pulling out ugly Christmas sweaters to create bales of that for upcycling. One I know is particularly pulling out old rock t-shirts, like vintage rock and roll t-shirts or like tour merch. Those have been very popular. So definitely they're able to pay attention to trends and make sure that those things are pulled out and used. And then white t-shirts may become like wash rags. They're used a lot in the automotive industry and car washes. So there's these very specific pockets where things will move, and then it is either in some cases landfilled or recycled. And recycling right now, kind of across the board for FABSCRAP as well, is really more downcycling. True recycling would be fabric back into fabric.
Right.
fabric. That's a nice soul. Downcycling means you're taking some item, it's going through a process, and then it doesn't have quite the same utility at the end of that process. So for us, we're shredding fabric. It becomes this fiber pulp called shoddy. And shoddy is used in insulation, carpet padding, mattress stuffing. It's also used in the automotive industry to line car doors or the trunks of cars. So more industrial use and not necessarily use again as fabric, but it does help extend the life of those fibers and keep them out of landfill and continue their like useful life. So that's sort of where the state of downcycling is. Fiber to fiber tech is definitely in process. Where I see it right now is either still so early that they're not ready to take volume, or needs volume so large that there's not that sort of collected amount ready to send, because sorting for that specific fiber can be really difficult. So like I said, I'm seeing fiber to fiber technology around 100% cotton, 100% poly, some cotton poly blends, and then nylon and some wool. So those are sort of the only place where I'm seeing real fiber regeneration that can become fabric again. But either too early, not ready to take huge volumes, or needs so much volume that it's hard to collect that in a clean and consistent way, particularly from post-consumer, where we may or may not know what's in a fabric. So yeah, there's sort of a whole evolution happening on the recycling end. And then upcycling, which we're starting to see a lot more of, even from thrift stores, is taking something and adding value to it. So where we have like millions of 6x6 inch swatches of fabric, we have a lot of local makers, students, artists, crafters who can create a quilt from that, or creating clothing from small pieces that were never clothing in the first place. That I would consider upcycling. Something small didn't have as much utility as what you're able to give it when you work with it. That's upcycling. And I'm really excited to see a lot of the work that's happening, creative work that's happening in that space.
Yeah, that's exciting. So kind of on the same thread, where do you think we'll be in 10 years? Do you think that, are you optimistic? Are you pessimistic? Do you think maybe FABSCRAP won't be needed in 10 years? What do you think?
I mean, every nonprofit sort of exists hoping that one day they don't have to exist, right? If they could perfectly solve the problem that they were created to address, one day they wouldn't exist. And so I would love if we've completely eliminated textile waste. I think in 10 years, what I would hope to see is that these fiber to fiber technologies are ready to take real volume. They can deal with a decent amount of contamination, meaning like if they need 100% cotton, they can actually take stuff that's like 90% cotton, and that extra 10% is okay in the system. Because then I think we could address a good majority of the textile waste that exists. Where, for anyone listening, where I think more development and research is needed is in sorting. We use volunteers to help us sort. Just a quick shout out, if you come and volunteer sort with us, you get 5 pounds of fabric for free.
Did everyone do
So
that?
we
Like
have
these students?
5 pounds of designer fabric for free if you can come help us sort for a session. But sorting is done by hand. We also have a sorting team that we have hired and work with. Even in post-consumer, all sorting is happening by hand, because you have to be able to check for its condition and what it is. And I'm seeing a little bit of AI work happening in the sorting space, but that's definitely sorting for recycling, sorting for reuse, sorting for what should be downcycled, etc. All of that's still happening by hand. And so, yeah, that's where I see probably one of the bigger bottlenecks.
Yeah. Yeah. So another thing I wanted to ask you is, so I think it's safe to assume that most of the people here, who are listening to you, you and I have this conversation, are concerned about this issue. That's why they're here. right? They're concerned, and probably really very concerned, deeply concerned. But it's also safe to say that there are a lot of people out there who don't think textile waste is a big problem, who it may be hard to reach, to educate them. And so I'm wondering what you think um, we may be able to do to solve that, to help people understand that this is a huge problem and that this connects to, quality of life and well-being and all those kinds of issues. How do we take that step to make people care?
Um, no small task there. I think there's a lot of competing sort of urgent problems. And so I can understand why in the scope of things that could be addressed and where activism is needed, why textile waste maybe gets pushed gets pushed further down that list. And so I think the easiest way where I've seen people kind of connect the dots is thinking about the industry as a whole and the impact of the industry as a whole and how global fashion has become, how many people it employs and sometimes employs rather unfairly. And so when you look at fashion being mostly extractive and giving very little back to planet or to the people who are making it, I think when you take that worldview and add people into the mix and understanding how everything is connected, sometimes I see that connect dots. Um, for me, it's definitely understanding like how much goes into um, making a garment, people making it, and the skill that takes. And I think sometimes that's a little disconnected. I think also thinking about the sort of make the fabric, make the et cetera, and whether that is cotton or it's polyester, which is essentially oil and plastic. I think
Yeah,
knowing the impact of those makes you want to sort of retain the value of those fibers and maintain the value of those garments longer.
yeah, yeah. I agree. I think that connecting this issue back to issues of justice in the workplace and employee rights and environmental justice, right? Like who's paying the price for all of this consumption and who's not,
Right.
definitely has the potential to help people see the challenges and the need for urgent action.
Well, and I know you've done some research sort of around these issues and what motivates people to maybe feel like more than just a consumer, or when it seems like there's so many competing problems, particularly in the environmental and climate change space, like not losing hope.
Hmm.
Um, so maybe you could share a little bit too of what
Yeah.
you
So
found to
yeah,
work.
yeah. I think. Well, I think that one of the challenges is that, and I kind of alluded to this one of the questions I asked you, is that so much pressure is placed on the consumer. There's so much, I think, we in our society often think of, the individual. We pride ourselves in taking individual responsibility for everything. But the truth is, we're not. We're individuals, yes, but we're individuals in a collective system, in a social system, and we act socially. And so there's limited, and this often comes up in my classes. Students say with somewhat with despair on their face, what I can change the way I eat. I can change, my shopping. I can go vegan. I can go zero waste, and it's just a drop in the ocean. And they're right, it is.
Mhm.
And so I
Yeah.
think that the one of the things that can help is to make it easier on consumers and not expect human nature to change, right? But to change the systems that are operating that are causing the problem. So human beings like things that are inexpensive. Human beings like things that are pretty. Human beings like things that are comfortable and convenient. So let's make all of those things possible in a way that's sustainable. And
Right.
so I think one of the things that gives me hope is looking at ways um, to add sort of green defaults. So like in other words, the default production is circular. The default
Mhm.
choice of energy is green. And you have to opt out of green energy instead of opt into it. So the effort
Right.
is in the is in the more destructive, environmentally destructive behavior, and the easier, convenient behavior is sustainable.
Yeah,
I think that
that makes, yeah, that makes total sense. And I think to the extent that we've talked about being able to have companies responsible for those changes so that like we don't have to do all the research as a consumer of like, is this product good or bad? I think to have companies more responsible for that from the beginning. One thing that I've heard recently from a lot of the brands that we work with, which I think can maybe be inspiring for the power that you have, is that I know we kind of talk, or people get told a lot that like vote with your dollar or like buy what you believe in. And that's really hard when we're talking about students and budgets, and not everybody can afford the most sustainable things. And so beyond what you can do as a consumer in buying a product, I'm seeing right now brands express that they feel a lot of pressure from consumers asking questions. And they really feel a pressure to have answers, and like good answers to the questions that they're being asked. And they're being asked so many more questions about their environmental work, their social justice work, and what they're doing for people and planet. And that doesn't even require a purchase on our part. It just requires asking questions. And so I think in that way, there's a lot of power there. A lot of our brands want to have data from FABSCRAP because they want to be able to speak to steps that they're taking, and they want to have numbers behind it, and they want to feel like they are doing something that's legitimate and documented, and it's all because consumers are asking. And so I think there's a lot of power there that that I'm seeing from even beyond what we can purchase or what we can use or change as individuals.
Yeah, that's great news. And I think we've seen some prominent examples, like the recent issue with that doesn't connect to what we're talking about, sustainability in clothing and textiles, but with the Walt Disney Company in Florida, and just having employees or consumers, or in their case guests, just asking questions, and then they have to defend what they're doing. I think there certainly does seem to be a movement toward greater transparency, and that's of course motivated by a desire to maintain market position, but it's not necessarily because anybody's buying anything, like you said. It's because they're just asking.
Right, right.
Yeah. So we don't have a lot of time left, so I'm wondering if anyone in the audience has questions for us. Want to pose? Stop talking for a minute. I don't see anything in the
And I
chat.
have one that I posted that I could bring. I'm not in the audience per se, but
Please.
okay.
Why don't you introduce yourself too?
Okay, I can even maybe turn my video on. Hi, Jessica. My name's Evie. I'm a professor at FIT as well. I'm an ecology professor. I'm also the Biodesign Challenge advisor, so I've had a lot of students who work in and around sort of sustainability issues, or are really concerned with sustainability issues. And quite a few students have volunteered with FABSCRAP and have really said that experience has really helped them sort of understand sort of the scope of the textile waste issue. And I guess I'm wondering, and there may not be a good answer for this, but I'm wondering if there's a way to sort of bring that experience to other people who may not have the chance to go and volunteer with FABSCRAP, maybe don't live in New York or don't live someplace where there's lots of sort of textile industry going on, to sort of bring that experience so they could see and sort of get more, sort of hands-on perspective of what the problem is. Do you think there's do you think there's a way to do that, to get people to sort of have a similar kind of experience?
In person, it's hard, and I think it's hard because all of our cities have evolved in a way to make waste disappear. And so like what FABSCRAP does, and why I think some of the impact is so visible, is that we're collecting it all, and because it takes a long time to sort and a long time to process and deal with properly, it sits in this giant pile in our warehouse. And so when you walk into the warehouse, you're seeing 30 to 40,000 pounds of fabric in one place. And that really doesn't happen outside of landfills, where an individual can like see that in one place. And so it's the closest equivalent, I guess, would be to imagine if your place of work or even your home, if when you put material at the curb to throw it out, if it didn't disappear for 3 months, like how big would that pile be? And then the connection that even when something goes away because we threw it away, it still goes somewhere, it still sits somewhere, it still is physically in space. And so, yeah, that's hard to do because we've become so efficient at removing unwanted things. But when you can sort of pause and slow that down and see it in physical space and time, that's where I think there is real impact. I'm I'm encouraged by how many cities I know are starting to open up their waste and recycling processing facilities to the public. Like sometimes they'll let school groups in, or individuals take a tour. And I think that is really, really positive too, if that's an option where you are, to be able to see how different materials are processed, the resources, not just like the physical space and the machinery, but like the human hands that are still sorting a lot of the material that we recycle or throw away. To be able to like see a landfill in person is probably one of the most impactful things you can do. It's not easy or accessible, but like making that effort to see that, I think, has a real effect on how people consume and purchase. But yeah, I agree that like that physical, being next to the physical material, and at FABSCRAP, it's all like all in black bags until we sort it. And so right next to this giant pile of black bags is our reuse materials and our like thrift store for materials. And so you're seeing the juxtaposition of like, it's not actually waste what's in these bags. It's so usable and can be so beautiful. And it's these designer scraps and materials. And so that also, I think, helps connect some dots too, of like the presentation matters. And when you have everything concealed away in these black bags in a pot, disappear somewhere, you're really not seeing the material and the resources for what they are or what they could be.
Thank you so much.
So on that point of volunteering and getting involved with FABSCRAP, how can we get involved? What
Yeah,
opportunities?
we would love to have people come into the space and volunteer. I'm glad that so many people have been positively impacted by it. We have 2 sessions a day, Tuesday through Saturday. It's a 3-hour session. We'll train you. You don't need to know anything about sorting. We'll train you, and then at the end of the session, you can shop for 5 pounds of fabric for free. We also have lots of digital workshops where makers and creatives in our community are teaching skills for how to utilize the fabric that you get at FABSCRAP. So that's everything from, we've done like denim macrame plant hangers to book bindings, beginner sewing, lots and lots of digital workshops happening throughout our online world and now in person again, thankfully. And then our online store and in-person store, everything is 30 to 60% below retail for the fabrics. And we do offer students an additional discount. And for our online store, actually, if you're listening today or see this, if you use the code EDU10, you'll get 10% off our online store. So there's lots of ways to kind of get involved in the solution, volunteering, shopping sustainable fabric. And if you're going into a company as a new employee or intern, mention FABSCRAP and hopefully we can make change there too.
Great. Are there any other questions from the audience? We're right at time, so might work out just perfectly. But I want to make sure that we use every moment we have Jessica with us. Anybody else have a question? No? Well, I just want to extend our thanks to you, Jessica, for your time today, and for the work that you're doing, and for welcoming our students again. And it's a great pleasure. You've been a friend of FIT's for a number of years. So we really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you for having me. This was great.
Thank you.